Borrowing biological analogies, and tonight, in a sense, we'd like to return the compliment. We have a distinguished biologist with us who's going to talk about the architecture of plants. I have to say, though, that I think he thinks that there is a kind of a rigor to architectural theory, which I'm afraid our subject actually doesn't have. That they have their own idea of the concept of architecture, which he will explain. Christopher Alexander, who again Adrian may not know, but he's a well-known architectural theorist, went into print saying that nature was not modular. And Adrian is going to question that and suggest that I think plants are very modular in a strategic sense. What I must do right now is plug his book, though. The book is wonderful. And Derek only has one more copy downstairs, and this is it. And I'm going to walk out when I've introduced. This is not to miss Adrian's lecture, but in order to return this to Derek, so I promised to do that before he shut. The book is absolutely wonderful. It's full of the most extraordinary images of plants and these extraordinary diagrams of the structure of their growth. So do buy the book. Anyway, Adrian's been here before and has been liked very much by audiences in the AA. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Adrian, and thank you very much indeed for coming, Adrian.
Thank you, John. Okay. Everybody, can you hear me all right at the back? Right, I'm going to be talking about plants, and these are very tangible things compared with maybe some of the topics you might previously been listening to in this series. But I am a botanist, I understand plants, I don't understand architecture, but I shall do my best to show you how we can look at the architecture of plants. Now, it's possibly very appropriate for me to be talking about plants right now because perhaps quite a few of you are watching the current series on television, The Private Life of Plants, David Attenborough, and he has brought plants to life maybe for a number of people. And mostly he's done that, as you have seen, by speeding up plants. Plants, generally speaking, to a lot of people, unfortunately, are unbelievably boring because they just sit there apparently doing nothing. Speed them up, time-lapse photography, and then things begin to make sense. I think it would be rather nice actually to take footage of animals walking about and to slow that down at the same rate as he has speeded up plants, and then animals would be utterly boring and more people would become botanists, but perhaps we can't do that. The other thing about animals, of course, is that they're cuddly and furry, they have big brown eyes, people enjoy looking at them, and you can't say the same about plants. Plants are just static things. More importantly, I think, the comparison, the bigger problem for a botanist is that plants are complex things. You know where you are with an animal. It's got a body, it's got a head, it's got a leg, it's got some legs, it's got a tail, it moves about, and indeed, as it grows bigger, it stays the same shape. So you always know where you are with an animal. It's not getting more and more complex. Trouble is with a plant, as it grows in size, so it becomes more and more complex, and you end up with these structures such as trees, which are indeed exceedingly complex and very difficult to understand exactly how this particular shape has come about. There was a Cambridge botanist nearly 100 years ago now who made this nice statement about trees being complex matters, but that their shaping is simple and in their graduated steps. I don't think Ward exactly knew why he could make that statement. He didn't really understand trees and other plants, but we do now to a large extent, and this is what I'm going to be explaining to you. We're going to look at plants, and trees in particular, as a construction kit, a Lego construction kit. If we can find the basic building blocks for the construction of a tree, and then understand how they're put together, then these big organisms will begin to make sense. So we're looking for the actual pieces of Lego, how are plants constructed, what are the building blocks, and more importantly, what are the instructions that put the blocks in the right place? What is the assembly instructions for a given plant in order that we can construct it? Okay, if we start perhaps with some really simple plants, then we can make sense of it. First of all, we've got to discover what our building block is. What's the fundamental piece of Lego? Well, that question is actually quite simple to answer. It's simply a bud. You all know what a bud is. It's, technically speaking, to a botanist, an apical meristem, which means it's a collection of cells in the center here that can undergo cell division and enlargement. The whole thing can get bigger and bigger, and the bud will grow, or at least has the potential to grow, into a shoot. So for the whole of this talk, my piece of Lego for a plant, my constructional unit, my module, totally disagree with that guy who said biology isn't modular. My module for a plant is simply a bud and the axis, the shoot into which it grows. Now the trouble with plants is that as this bud does grow, grows out in length, so it produces leaves. Quite an obvious fact. And I'm sure you're aware that as each leaf is produced, so associated with each leaf is another bud. So we have potentially a population explosion of buds. As soon as a bud grows into a shoot, automatically it produces more buds, and those buds will have their own buds, and so on. So we have potentially here a chaotic situation, an enormous population explosion of apical meristems of buds. Unless there's some control behind this, then you're going to end up with a completely wrecked, messy sort of plant with lots and lots of constructional units all over the place that doesn't operate economically in trapping light. So unless we're looking for a control behind the location of these constructional units. So let me start with possibly the most simplest plant that we can look at in these terms, in these Lego kit terms. And that would be a palm tree. Here's a typical palm tree. It started life with just one bud in the seed at ground level, and that single bud has grown up progressively up and up here, producing a stem as it goes. And hidden in the middle of these leaf bases here, that's one leaf there, another leaf there, tucked right in the middle of those leaves, protected by those leaves, is the same apical meristem, the same bud that this tree started life with maybe 15 years ago. So I hope you'll excuse my very crude little diagram here, felt tip pen diagram. That's all I need to display a palm tree. That diagram there is a palm tree. It's represented by one arrowhead at the top here, which is the bud still growing up, and that is the product of that bud down here. Just one unit, one module. In actual fact, that identical diagram would do just as well for a cabbage. Think of a cabbage, it's got one little bit of stalk at the bottom, lots of leaves attached to it, and nothing else at all. So that diagram works for a cabbage plant, or it works for this palm tree. Now, as this one apical meristem has produced this one structural unit, it has indeed had lots of leaves attached to it. Most of them have fallen off. And in theory, at least, every single leaf did have its own bud. You say the bud is in the axil of the leaf. But the fate of these buds is simply to die, programmed death. Only one bud, this one in here, that one there, is doing anything. All the rest have aborted, so they don't take part in my construction kit. But this is now a mature palm tree, and now these buds sitting on the original axis are doing something, and those of you who can see it here, these are inflorescences, clusters of flowers growing out at the side of the palm tree. So I have to modify my diagram slightly and put in these dots. This represents a cluster of flowers on either side. So my construction kit for that first palm tree has got now two units. It's got the vegetative one growing up the middle, and it's got some side ones here, which are clusters of flowers on the side. If these components here were loose in a box, I would be able to pick them out and fit them on to create that palm tree. In terms of a cabbage, I've now created a broccoli, because I've stuck some flowers on the side. Broccoli is the same species as cabbage, it's just genetically slightly different. Okay, lots of palm trees here, all behaving the same way, but this one is different. In this particular palm tree, different species, that apical meristem, that single bud that has produced this whole structure over maybe a period of 40 or 50 years, has now changed its mind and started to obey a different set of instructions and has turned itself into one huge inflorescence cluster of flowers at the top of the palm. And once all the fruits are shed from that top, then that particular tree, palm tree, is going to die. So I need a slightly different diagram here. Here are my lateral inflorescences here, and there's my terminal inflorescence at the top. So I have a slightly different diagram, and my construction kit for this palm tree consists of a different sort of unit. When it hasn't got an arrow at the top growing on indefinitely, it's come to a dead end. That is a cauliflower now. Again, the same species as a cabbage. So that particular diagram will do equally well for a cauliflower or this palm tree. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that particular buds have particular fates, particular potentials, and that these potentials are fixed into the system. If all these other buds started to grow into big trunks here, then we'd have a very strange plant and it would actually be mechanically unstable. So within this population of buds, this potentially chaotic situation, there's very strong control over the fate of the individual apical meristems. Okay, so how does any one bud decide to do a particular thing? How does it know what to do? Well, this is an exceedingly complex business. The environment can have an effect in terms of temperature, light, day length. There are very many things happening within the plant in terms of the movement of hormones and auxins controlling the activity of particular buds. But of course it all boils down ultimately to a matter of genes and sequences of DNA controlling individual buds. Now, very little is known about this at present. A little bit more is known about the construction of flowers. There's that top inflorescence of that palm tree, a whole mass of flowers. If you look at flower structure, flowers are, generally speaking, very conservative in their architecture, in their form, and they're very predictable in terms of what you expect to find. If a flower makes a mistake, then it's pretty obvious. These are supposed to be rose flowers here, but quite probably the individual gene which should be triggering off the production of petals is a mutant, it's gone wrong, and these flowers are churning out green leaves instead of petals. And it's when plants make mistakes like this that there's a lot of information to be gained about the controlling mechanisms behind them. And recently, a number of people have been studying in detail the construction of flowers because you know what you should be getting. And the example that I want to show is a little flower in the cabbage family. If you can't read anything on the left here, don't worry, I'll explain what's going on. There's a little plant in the cabbage family, and it's called Arabidopsis, and it has now become effectively the Drosophila of the plant world because it has very few chromosomes, and people are beginning to read the genetic information, the DNA sequences in Arabidopsis, and to understand exactly what's going on. This is a photograph taken from a Scientific American publication in November, the end of last year, by a guy called Merowitz, who's studying this particular plant. Okay, in a conventional flower, and this is true of the Arabidopsis, you expect to find a particular sequence of organs in the flower. Probably most of you are familiar with this from biology at school. Sepals, petals. There are 4 of them in this case because the cabbage family is the crucifery across 4 petals. Sepals, petals, then stamens, a ring of stamens, and then a ring of carpels in the center. These are shown diagrammatically over there. Now, it's possible to trace the actual genes, DNA sequences that are controlling the production of sepals and petals and stamens and carpels. In other words, this is a flower bud. It's producing organs in sequence, a whirl of little primordia, as they're called, and a second whirl of primordia, and so on into the middle of the flower. And each whirl of primordia is being told what to do by a particular gene. And Meyerowitz suggests, and has now shown for sure, that there are just effectively 3 genes controlling the production of these 4 sets of characters. And it works something like this. Let's call them gene A, B, and C. If gene A is turned on, and a gene can either be operating or non-operating, so if the gene is turned on, the gene is being expressed, then you get sepals. And in the first whirl of these organs, gene A is turned on and B and C are turned off. So these first items that are produced in the flower are indeed sepals. In the second collection, where the petals are, gene A is turned on and gene B is turned on, but C is turned off, and that produces the petals. In the third whirl, B and C are turned on, and that gives you stamens. In the fourth whirl, just C is turned on, and then you get carpels in the centre. If things go wrong in the system, then you get these very bizarre flowers produced. They're bizarre in the sense that they have the right type of structure, sepals, petals and so on, but in the wrong place. And these fit in perfectly with the activity of these 3 genes. So if gene A is turned off by mistake and doesn't work at all, it turns out that gene C automatically turns itself on. So for those of you at the front can see this, you end up with C in the first whirl, so you get carpels on the very outside of the flower. Then you get C and B, and then C again. So it's carpels, stamens, stamens, and carpels. And so on for these other 2 examples down here. When B is turned off by mistake, you get A, C, C. And when C is turned off by mistake, you get A, B, A. And that gives you, at the bottom here, a flower which consists of sepals, petals, petals, and then sepals in the centre. So it's quite a complicated process in a way, but not really. There are 4 different structures, just 3 genes triggered on and off can produce those various structures. Okay, we're rather a long way now from buds and architecture of trees, but I'll come back round to that. And I can do that by bringing in another picture. This is actually from the New Scientist, also reproduced in Nature. Precedes Meyerowitz's works. This is a guy called Cohen working with snapdragon antirrhinums. Different family of plants altogether. The first interesting feature is that Cohen discovered the same genes, A, B and C, control the format for a flower in antirrhinum. Sepals, petals, stamens and carpels in the middle. You can't see them. When I say the same genes, I mean the same, or practically the same sequence of bases in the DNA. So these are 2 evolutionarily distinct flowers, the Arabidopsis and the snapdragon, but they've got the same genes controlling their flower formation, which is nice. It means that a long time ago, when flowers were first evolving, that particular setup appeared and is now maintained maybe by lots of different flowers, but it's been identified in these particular 2. But rather more importantly is the fact that genes just don't operate by themselves. Genes are turned on by other genes. There's a sort of a cascade sequence of events. There's a hierarchy of genes. So before you can decide that you're going to turn the particular items into petals or sepals, you've got to decide whether or not you're going to have a flower at all or not. So there's a master gene, if you like, sitting behind A, B and C, which decides whether this bud is going to turn into a flower, it's a flower bud, or whether it's going to turn into a vegetative shoot. If that particular gene is turned on in antirrhinum, then you get a flower. If that particular gene is turned off, maybe by mistake, then you get a vegetative shoot. Now this has got a fundamental importance for the plant. As far as the gardener is concerned, maybe you want this gene always to be turned on and to have as many flowers as possible. Well, that would be okay from the plant in the sense that it would produce lots of seeds, but it would not have a large vegetative photosynthesizing, light-capturing branch system to support the production of all those flowers and seeds, and it would probably fail. Conversely, if you had a plant that was all mistakes and only ever produced vegetative shoots, then clearly no flowers, no seeds, and no future. The plant has got some nice compromise between the two. But the important thing here is that the fate of that bud, either flower or vegetative shoot, is dependent on just one gene being turned on or off. If this was a cabbage, turn off this gene and you've got a Brussels sprout. Same species again, just a slight subtle change in its gene makeup. The sort of strict parlance for this is to say that this meristem, this bud, before it knows what to do, is competent. It is in a state where it can receive the information to do one thing or other. It's in a receptive state. An apical meristem is said to be competent. And once a particular gene has been triggered to operate at that site, then that bud is said to be determined, and then it has a fixed fate, and is going to go through a particular sequence of subsequent enlargement and use another set of genes, A, B, and C in this case, to produce the flower, or some other genes we don't know about to produce this vegetative shoot. So in our Lego kit, we've got all these buds sitting in the system, and although we don't know how yet, they're all being controlled by their genetic background. So perhaps we can go back to some trees and spot what's going on in terms of Lego kit format. And I'm starting with slightly more elaborate plants than palms now, but still very precise ones. This is a species of monkey puzzle, a tropical monkey puzzle, Araucaria excelsior, I think it is. Immediately, a very neat geometry here. So what's happening in terms of our construction kit? It's simply one apical meristem, as in the palm tree, still growing up at the top there. That little patch of cells is the one that started originally in the seed at the base. So we have one Lego construction piece there, but now we have a second type of Lego construction, which is a bud which grows out sideways. But there are long gaps between these whorls of horizontally growing branches, and there are indeed buds stacked all the way along here, which are either dead or perhaps dormant. But their fate is to do nothing. The fate of these is to grow out sideways. The fate of that single one there is to grow on up into the air. So in construction terms, this is a very simple plant, but a little bit more complex than the palm tree, which only had that one single axis up the middle. And I'm going to give you a few more examples just to show you the type of setup. This is a bit closer to home now. A sycamore tree, it's just got two types of construction, two types of module, and there's the one growing up the centre again. We've seen that repeatedly, but now you've got also some other branches that are growing pretty vertically. So there's something else going on in here to give you a particular growth direction with respect to gravity. This one is at sort of 45 degrees-ish. In the previous example, it was very definitely at 90 degrees to gravity, very precise. So a sycamore tree, at least a young one, is a very precise format. But if you look at some tropical trees in more detail, then things become rather more complicated. Right, now what have we got here? We've got a trunk up the centre, and if we could climb up to the very top of it, again we would find just one apical meristem, one bud at the top, and that's the original one that was sitting in the seed 30 or 40 years ago. Again, we've got whorls of branches at intervals, and nothing in between, so there are dormant or dead buds at these locations here, and then we've got these large branches growing out sideways. But again, if you can actually see the detail in this photograph, you'll see little twigs sitting up vertically along this branch, and it's true of all the branches. There are 1 centimetre thick twigs sitting up on the branch at about 1 metre intervals. And what's happened here in Lego construction terms is that a bud has grown out sideways, horizontally, along here, and as it has done so, secondary thickening, you know, rings in a wood make the trunk of a tree or a branch of a tree fatter. That particular part of this one module has got fatter and fatter. That's a little bit here. But then the genes have done a flip and have switched, and that apical meristem that was growing horizontally sideways has now been told to start growing vertically upwards, and its bit of stem not to thicken up. So in Lego kit terms, I've got one constructional piece going straight up the middle. There's only one of those. I've got a second constructional piece growing out sideways but thickening up and then starting to grow vertically. And then a daughter bud sitting on it is again grown out sideways and vertically upwards and so on. So that whole big fat branch that you can see there is actually made up of a series of modules, each of which was produced by one apical meristem, one bud, which is still growing. Technical term for this type of growth where you have an axis produced by a whole series of units is a sympodial axis, in contrast with the monopodial axis here, which still has its original meristem. If you just walk past that tree, you wouldn't notice that. You might marvel at these whirls of massive branches, but you'd never guess that that little stick there was actually the top end of that major component down at the bottom. And that tree will carry on, according to those lines, forever. This is the same tree 10 years later. This is the advantage of getting old. You can go back and take pictures of things a second time, and you can still see those little twigs. They're now several meters tall, but that is still just one unit there, a second unit there, third unit there, and so on. So that's a slightly more elaborate tree. Okay, well, what's going on here? We're going even deeper into the tropics. This tree hasn't got a common name. It's called an Alstonia. And this patch of tissue here is what's happened to the original bud. The original bud has developed an axis up the top here and then has aborted at this position here. So that the genetic information for that particular axis, the original meristem in the seed, was to grow maybe for 2 or 3 meters and then die. And just below the position where it died, 4 buds have grown out sideways. So there are 4 branches growing out sideways beneath that now dead apex. So my diagram, my kit diagram, has got to be a vertical axis here with my blob representing in the impossibility of any further development, and then branches growing out sideways at this point, and there are actually 4 of them, always 4 in this tree. It can count up to 4, it always produces 4 branches. Now this is where we need David Attenborough and his time-lapse speeding up situation, because if we could sit and watch this tree for the next 6 months, we'd find that one of those 4 branches has a different potential to the others. And its potential, due to some very strange anatomy, is to turn itself into a vertical branch. It will bend into the vertical. So that branch there is going to bend up until it is standing straight up vertically. There it is there. I'll go back 6 months. That particular unit was coming out sideways. Now it has grown up into the vertical. So this tree is producing a trunk now, a sympodial trunk, and it is going to have a whole series of these units. Up there, die, 4 daughters out sideways, wait 6 months, choose one, bend it up into the vertical, die at that point there, produce 4 more, choose one, bend that into the vertical, and so on. Very strange way of producing a vertically growing item. But there are a lot of tropical trees that do this in all continents, totally unrelated to each other. If you strip the bark and the leaves off them, you wouldn't be able to tell one apart. They have all evolved either independently or at some stage way back in their history, this way of producing a trunk. But again, in construction terms, we've just got 2 types. No, we haven't. We've got 3 two types of unit. We've got the vertical one and the horizontal one. Of course, there's an easier way of producing the same result. That's a close-up of that, the bulging that takes place as this one has come up, bending up from behind towards you. There is a quicker way of doing that, and that is to grow vertically right from the word go. And that's what takes place in this tree, whose name I don't know. In this case, again, the original module grew up to this point and then died. There's the dead surface there. Had a number of branches growing out sideways. In this case, there are three, I think, in this species, one here, and one at the back. And then sometime later, maybe up to a year later, one of the many buds dormant on this axis is triggered off into growth, and it grows immediately vertically upwards. And there it is, yet this young branch going straight on up to be the next component of the trunk. So the trunk is a very sort of jointed sort of construction. A bizarre way of growing. Here's a much older tree. There's the first unit like this over here. You can see the branches growing out sideways. We've now lost that bend because of the thickening that's taken place. Here's the next point at which it happened. You can see the branch growing on up, and there are two or three more way up in the air. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, for a start, this fate, this fixed potential in buds really is fixed. Cocoa, as a tree, Theobroma, grows in exactly this way. And if you break off that vertical branch there and root it artificially and stick it in the ground, then it'll carry on growing vertically and produce a decent tree according to this species, as you might expect. If you break off this branch here at the side and root it artificially and stick it in the ground, it'll grow along the ground. It'll grow 20 or 30 meters along the ground. It's totally lost any ability to be a trunk. It's not used to producing roots, of course. In fact, the roots themselves grow horizontally as well. So you get a completely horizontal type plant if you remove that and root it in the ground. So this fate is really well and truly fixed. You can pick this up often by doing sort of surgical manipulation experiments on plants. Another reason for studying plants rather than animals, nobody moans at you if you chop plants about. This is a little diagram here of a plant in the tomato-potato family. This picture was drawn for me by a PhD student of mine, Trevor Dines, who works on this plant. It's called Nicandra. It's not a tree at all. It's just an annual plant. You grow it in your garden for its flowers. But it does have a very precise architecture, which is sort of familiar to some of the pictures I've been showing you for trees. Okay, so what have we got here in terms of Lego kit constructions? Obviously, rather more complicated than just the two types we've got here. But we can break it down quite easily. We've got axis type 1, which is developed from the bud in the seed, and that's this one up the centre here, which has grown for quite a distance, producing leaves all the way, and then it has had a terminal flower. And for many of these plants in the Solanaceae, the tomato family, there will be a precise number of leaves. Nicandra is a little bit vague about this, 9, 10 or 11 leaves maybe, but for other species it'll always be 5 leaves, always 6 leaves maybe, different species always 7, so they can count. This one's got 9 or 10 leaves, and the buds in the axils of the leaves are competent to do something, but they're not yet determined. They haven't been set in their fate, perhaps. That will come later. So that's the one type of axis, the one up the top here. We've then got a second Lego kit here. There's two of them, one there and one there. And by definition, they carry two daughters. There's that one, and both different to this one. And then our third construction kit is a solitary unit there, which bears another solitary unit, another solitary unit. There's a whole sympodial sequence of the third type at that point there. One final refinement for Nicandra is that this top bud, below the terminal flower, always develops one of these type 3 units. So you get an extra sequence of sympodial branching at that point. So we've now got 5 of these units. And if you look down on this plant from above, it's a very nice pentagonal arrangement of flowers neatly laid out in 3 dimensions. So every single Nicandra plant, given a nice pot and plenty of water and soil, will do that for you. We call that its architectural model, and that is its genetic possibility, and maybe there are only as many genes controlling this as there are types of units. 1, 2, 3. There are just 3 types of units involved. But the interesting thing comes when you hack this plant about, because this sequence of dormant buds has a hierarchy of possibility. If you cut the plant off at the top, then you determine, as it were, this particular bud, and it actually then starts to grow. And that bud at the top turns out to be a type 3 bud, and this is what you get, a sequence of these little single units. If you chop the plant down a little bit further down, you find you're dealing with a type 2 bud, one of these here, and you get that particular format. That there, that complex there, is exactly the same as this complex here. If you chop the plant off at the bottom, you can see you reproduce the whole architecture that you had up there. So effectively, these 7 or 8 buds, dormant buds on that original axis, are of 3 types. The ones at the bottom have the potential to produce the whole of that upper part. The ones in the middle can produce this type 2 format, and the ones at the very top can produce just the type 1 format. They have different fates depending on their position. So that's a very neat system and seems to work quite well. When a dormant bud grows out to reproduce the whole architecture of the original plant, we call that reiteration. It's a repetition of events. So I would call this a total reiteration here, because that dormant bud, this one here, having been forced to grow, is reiterating the whole architectural model for this plant. These others up here are reiterations, but they're only partial reiterations because they're only producing part of the whole model. And this now gives us a clue to understand much more complex trees. All the trees I've shown you so far have been pretty simple, just a couple or 3 types of Lego construction and very obvious geometric format. Nothing like those horrendous sycamore trees that we saw originally. But we can now go back to our trees and look for reiteration, that is, a repetition of the basic pattern. We started off, if you remember, with a monkey puzzle, an araucaria. This tree has only got its 2 types of constructional unit, the monopodial meristem going up there, and these monopodial ones growing out in whorls sideways. That tree is never going to become more elaborate at all. In other words, it doesn't reiterate, and you'll see the consequences if it did in a moment. Another species of monkey puzzle, this one is the one that was grown in Great Britain. It actually comes from South America. As this monkey puzzle goes up and up in the air, same original format, one meristem doing this, another type of meristem growing sideways, but then the bottom branches die and drop off, and they die deliberately, again, programmed death as these bottom branches die off. And in the much older tree, the consequence of this is to allow a lot of light now in sideways to the base of the tree. And this light, enhanced light regime, is enough to determine, to trigger off buds that are sitting here dormant, and they will, one by one, begin to grow, and they are then represent total reiterations, and that little bud developing at that point is duplicating exactly the way this 60, 70-year-old tree originally started growing. So we have effectively a baby tree growing on the side, as it were, of the mother tree. The guy who lives in this house doesn't like this. He keeps hacking these things off. That is now missing. But I did manage to find a picture as a close-up of him. Did manage to find a picture of the tree some time ago when it had lots of these reiterations at the base, now all chopped off by the house owner. So he doesn't know what's going on, but I suppose he just likes his nice Victorian format of the monkey puzzle. So these are total reiterations in this particular monkey puzzle. There are other monkey puzzles, yet another species, which just have partial reiterations. Palm trees on the left here, there's one single axis, one meristem. They're the simplest type of plant. Here, one meristem producing your whole trunk. Whorls of branches again, but in this case, perhaps you can spot that there are 3 clusters of side branches in that particular tree. In actual fact, all the branches below that point have dropped off, but then buds have started to reiterate and grow out sideways, and these are all new branches growing out sideways here, and these are even younger new branches growing out sideways lower down. Whoops. So my slightly fuzzy diagram here, there's the original trunk, its meristem is still active at the top. There are the branches that belong to that original model. These are younger branches growing outside there. These are even younger branches growing out sideways here. So in developmental terms, you've got to watch what's happening. This tree is constantly changing its shape as it grows up in time. Be another useful thing to have some time-lapse photography of it. So perhaps we can look at messy trees now, and in terms of reiteration, they will begin to make sense. This is actually an adult Alstonia. Alstonia was one of the ones that had the weird case of one branch, trunk goes up, dies, has side branches, then a bud takes on up and goes over. But you can't see that apparently. But if you home in on this tree and look further into it, you can begin to see these reiterations. There are lots of vertically growing branches at the top of this tree, any one of which is behaving to the original format. So this is now a more chaotic situation. The original tree is there in a very precise format. It has a whole mass of dormant buds, and then light or damage are causing some of these buds in a rather indiscriminate way to produce repetitions of the original format. So as a whole, the plant looks a bit of a mess, but in detail, it's not a mess at all. It's a complex matter totally, but not in its graduated steps. And the same thing will happen for sycamore. Go back to our sycamore here. If you remember, one bud up there, single buds producing these pretty vertical shoots, but there are 2 branches in there that are different to all the others. There's this one at this point here, and there's another one there that are growing more vertically than the rest. And if we were able to age those, as my diagram for them, you'd find they're very much younger than other branches coming out at the same level. In other words, they've developed from dormant buds. So the sycamore has got its basic model, which is to produce one axis up the middle and whorls of more or less vertical branches. It has the possibility now of producing these reiterations, and each of those major branches is going to give you an extra trunk, if you like, and begin to build up the huge framework of an adult sycamore tree. And the bigger the tree gets, the more frequently it'll produce these extra vertically growing branches, but progressively the smaller they will become as you come up to the top of the tree. So a mature sycamore tree looks a mess, but any one of these components that you can sometimes pick out is effectively one of these reiteration events. And any one of these components is simply behaving according to the basic model for that tree. So now we've come effectively a full circle, and we can look at a whole range of trees and know that these palm trees are dead simple, one piece of Lego kit of one sort. These Araucarias monkey puzzles a little bit more complicated, 2 sorts plus the partial reiteration. This job here, haven't a clue what it is or what it's doing. Sycamore, we can understand that, and so on. So the take-home message is that a plant, and I've dealt with trees, but it applies to any plants, it's a population of buds. There are very few fates for the various buds, basically on, off, and then if you're on, what is your potential? And then it's simply the duplication of the parts on and on, that makes your tree finally such a messy object. It's all down to the genes, obviously, underneath. Okay, I shall stop at that point. Thank you.
Very much, Adrian. That was marvellous. Well, at the usual format, if we can take a few quick questions now, general interest, and then anyone who'd like to lobby Adrian, particularly with detailed questions, perhaps at the bar after. Are there any general questions?
Obviously, some plants have got more dormant buds than others.
Yes.
Is there any kind of pattern that is followed? I mean, some plants have got loads and loads of buds, and others.
Well, okay, that's a common observation if you're in your garden and you're hacking a hedge down. Some hedges you hack them down and you wreck the hedge, and others, okay, it sprouts up again. I can't answer that. This is unknown territory. It would make sense to have lots of dormant buds. Some plants just don't do that. Maybe this is just built into their evolutionary history. They've developed in a location where that sort of damage never occurs, and it's a waste of time and energy maintaining a huge population of live buds. As a trunk of a tree gets fatter and fatter, buds that were born on that tree when it was this big will move out with the trunk. So when you cut the tree down, they will sprout out. But they're live buds. They've got to be fed and maintained. They're using resources. If you don't expect to get chopped down, maybe you can dispense with this living burden that you have to carry all the time. That's all I can think of immediately. Certainly in the case of the palm trees, it doesn't make sense to have lots of living buds. A palm tree, albeit quite a fat trunk, hasn't got the ability to grow in width. And anybody who's seen young palm trees, they always are growing at ground level with all the leaves coming straight out of the ground. And they'll be like that for maybe 10 or 15 years, building up very slowly a wide stem in the ground, because each leaf that's added is on a slightly wider base than the previous one. So the palm tree develops a cone-shaped base in the ground. And then once it's got itself to a good size, then it'll start coming up in height. It's called establishment growth. It establishes its width in the ground before it grows in height. So if a bud near the top started to grow out, it would be just a little bud. It would have to establish itself, and you'd have a mechanical nonsense because you'd have a big fat branch tapering to a minute fixation point to the trunk. So palm trees haven't got lots of dormant buds because they couldn't grow. If they did grow, they'd fall off.
Adrian, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about, I mean, we're talking about an idealized kind of growth. You could talk a little bit more about what happens when that strategy for growth is influenced either by the close proximity to other plants in a forest or in particular environment with, say, strong prevailing wind or particular light directions, which will, to what extent or how does that programmed strategy adapt to specific particular environmental conditions?
Well, this must be the fact that each bud with its gene that's going to make it do something is being governed by genes further up in the hierarchy, which are then turned on by maybe some environmental effect. So for some trees, if the light conditions get very much better, that is sufficient to trigger off the buds to start growing on that side. And conversely, if the light conditions are very bad on the other side, then the buds won't be triggered off to grow. So though each bud has the same potential, there's something else further up the line controlling it. Is that what you mean?
Does that same thing apply to damage? I mean, sort of
Yes.
losing a branch in
Yes.
lightning or
Yes.
a rampant neighbour with an axe? Or
Exactly. I've talked about reiteration, which is the reproduction of the whole format from a dormant bud. I've talked about total reiteration and partial reiteration, but we also have the possibility of traumatic or adaptive reiteration. Traumatic due to damage, adaptive due to good conditions, which are your two scenarios.
The roots of the low ground have the same sort of
Well, up to about 6 weeks ago, I would have said no. If you ever see roots, they just look a rather haphazard mess. But I've just been sent an envelope full of published papers from a French university, which has got the description of the architecture of tree roots of a number of species, and they're not the same as the architecture above ground, but there are nevertheless similar geometric possibilities under the ground, and indeed reiteration just the same. So for a particular tree, it's quite possible that if you can look at its root system, it does grow initially in quite a precise manner, and then it becomes more and more complicated as extra buds, root buds, start to add into the system. Trouble is with the ground, it's very heterogeneous and messy. It's got rocks and other roots and all sorts of things in it. Whereas above ground, if there aren't any neighbours, you've just got a volume of air to fill. So I think my assumption that roots are going to be messy is really because the roots are growing in a messy place. And if you could grow a tree in a very uniform sand or something, then it would be able to produce its genetic format rather than the environmentally imposed one.
Further to that, in your book you have a section on plant roots, and I think primarily on those that are
Above ground.
How does one observe those below ground?
Well, that's
Really
yeah, that's what I was going to follow on to say. There's not much information about roots simply because it's exceedingly difficult to get at them.
has no one used ultrasound for that?
I don't know. Would that work? Would you not pick up?
It might.
What about all the rocks and things?
They would react differently.
Okay, maybe I could.
This is something I thought might have been.
Yeah, not that I know of, but okay, certainly that's an idea. Well,
Follow on to John's question. In the situation you've got extreme environmental conditions and you force the plant to adapt in a particular way, is there a built-in counterbalance strategy by the structure to actually correct that?
in terms of the roots, yes, there is. The roots will grow in preference on the opposite side to the tree above ground. Do you mean that sort of?
Yeah, how's that information actually passed down from some of the structure?
Well, I can't answer that. It's got to be, again, the movement of information such as hormones within the system, stresses and strains. If you've got, I'm guessing now, if one half of the tree is being compressed effectively and the back side of it is being tensioned, then the cells on one side are having a different environment to live in than the cells on the other. Maybe that causes them to produce different substances. And then these can pass back down the trunk and trigger off extra growth on the corresponding side. That might work. Okay, certainly in a branch of a tree, if you cut a section through the base of the branch of the tree, it's not circular, it's not cylindrical. It's got a bias, a bulge of extra wood either at the bottom in a hardwood or at the top in a softwood. It's called reaction wood, tension wood or compression wood, which helps support the whole system. So that is developing according to, because cells are being squashed and therefore reacting accordingly. Maybe the same sort of system can operate but at a longer distance.
You describe various different strategies, these architectures of that. How many are there? What is the total range?
Well, this term architecture for models was devised by a Frenchman called Halley, and he and his colleagues have looked at tropical trees throughout the world and indeed temperate trees and sort of come ground to a halt at about 23 different formats. I've shown you half a dozen here, each one distinct, but they came up. I mean, people have argued vehemently that, okay, why not 24 or 124 or whatever, it depends on your personal interpretation, but the intriguing thing is that totally unrelated trees on different continents, as I say, grow in precisely the same way, and often very precise and bizarre ways.
Certainly to the layman it seems extraordinary at first sight that the cabbage and the palm tree should be the similar kind of strategic structure and the broccoli as well. I mean, that sort of way of thinking is not immediately obvious.
You're the first to hear that, because that's not written down anywhere. I just conjured that up on the train coming here, but it's true. It's true. It's just one meristem.
Any more questions? Well, I'm sure Adrian will be pleased to talk to anyone at the bar for a few minutes afterwards. So thank you very much again. Thank you.
Thank you.